What would you do if the town that threw you out at 18 sold you its biggest ranch 4 years later for the two crumpled dollars still folded in your coat pocket? Jane Walker rode back into Dry Creek at 22 with nothing but a bedroll, a borrowed mare, and a name the town had tried to forget. By sundown the next day, the courthouse clerk would stamp a deed in her hand for 1,000 acres of cattle country that a powerful family had let rot. But what was waiting beneath the floorboards of that ruined ranch house would rewrite her blood, her town, and the man who had once run her out. Settle in. Let us know where you're watching from. This is a long ride, and the truth is buried deep. The wind found her first. It came down off the ridge the way it always had, dry and full of grit, tugging at the brim of her hat as the mare crested the low rise above town. Dry Creek lay below her the way she remembered it, a scatter of tin roofs and plank walls strung along a road the color of ash. The church still leaned a little to the east. The livery still had that black scar on its south wall where a lantern had fallen when she was 12. The bell over the mercantile still hung crooked. 4 years, and nothing had shifted an inch. Jane sat the mare a long moment before she nudged her forward. Her coat was thinner than the weather asked for. Her boots were split along one heel. In the inner pocket, folded twice against her chest, were 2 paper dollars soft as cloth from being carried without being spent. She had earned them in Cheyenne, scrubbing floors in a boarding house through a winter she did not care to remember. They were all she owned. She had not planned to come back. She had planned to keep going west until the country ran out of west, but her mother had died in April, alone, in a room above a laundry 200 miles from any grave that carried her name. And something in Jane had turned around like a horse smelling home. Grief did that. It did not ask permission. At the edge of town, a boy on a fence post watched her pass. His mouth opened and closed. He hopped down and ran. She let him run. Word would move faster than she could. By the time she tied the mare at the trough outside the courthouse, 3 men were already standing on the boardwalk watching her without pretending not to. She knew 2 of them. The third she did not, and he was the one whose eyes stayed on her longest. She touched the mare's neck once, quietly, the way a person touches a friend before going into a room they might not walk out of. Inside, the courthouse smelled of old paper and lamp oil. The clerk was a narrow man with ink on his knuckles. He looked up, blinked, and set his pen down slowly, the way a person sets down something breakable. Miss Walker, he said. Sir. You come back. I have. He glanced toward the door behind her, then leaned an inch closer over the counter. What can this office do for you? Jane laid the $2 on the wood between them. They looked very small there, and very tired. The old Halloran place, she said. I heard it's for auction? The clerk's face did a strange, careful thing. It went still, then softer, then still again. He looked at the money, he looked at her, he looked at the door. That ranch, he said, has been on the tax rolls 7 years unpaid. The county set the minimum bid at $1 to be rid of it. No one has come. He wet his lips. No one has come, Miss Walker, because of who used to own it. You understand? I understand. $2 would buy it twice. Then I'll buy it twice, Jane said. He looked at her a long time. Then he took up his pen. Outside on the boardwalk, the third man had not moved. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, and wore a coat cut better than any coat in Dry Creek had a right to be. When Jane stepped back into the light with the folded deed inside her coat, he laughed. It was not a small laugh. It was the kind of laugh a man uses to make sure the street hears him. $2, he said, "for 1,000 acres of rattlesnakes and rot." Jane did not look at him. She untied the mare. "Girl," he called louder, "you know what you just bought? You bought a graveyard with a barn on it. You bought the reason your daddy left this town in a box." Her hand paused on the rein, just for a breath. Then she swung up into the saddle. "Ride out there," he said, still smiling. "See how long you last. The land'll take those $2 back before the moon's full." She turned the mare north, toward the ridge road, and did not answer him. Behind her, the laughter of 2 or 3 others joined his, thin in the wind. An old woman on the church steps watched Jane pass, and did not laugh. Her mouth moved once, silently, as if she were saying a prayer or a warning, and Jane, who did not yet know which, only tipped her hat and kept riding. So here she was, 18 when they ran her out, 22 when she came back, and the deed to a cursed ranch folded against her heart for the price of a hot meal. What made her spend her last $2 on a place the whole town called poisoned? What did the powerful family that once owned it want so badly to bury there? And why did the old woman on the church steps look at Jane as if she had seen a ghost walk home? If this is your kind of story, stay with us. Leave a comment telling us where you're riding in from, and subscribe so you don't miss what she finds under the floorboards. Because the ranch had been waiting a long time, and it knew her name. The ridge road climbed slow out of Dry Creek, and Jane did not push the mare. She let the animal find its own pace, hooves ticking against the loose shale, and behind her the laughter of the men on the boardwalk thinned into wind and then into nothing at all. She could still hear the shape of it, though, the way a bell keeps ringing in the ear after the rope has gone still. Girl, graveyard, rattlesnakes, and rot. She had known the tall man's laugh before she had known his face. It belonged to the kind of man who had never once been told no by the land or by anyone standing on it. At the edge of the mercantile, 2 women in aprons stopped their sweeping to watch her pass. One of them leaned to the other and said something behind her hand. The other laughed, short and sharp, then covered her mouth. A boy ran alongside the mare for 20 paces and shouted, "You gonna dig up bones, miss?" before an older brother caught him by the collar and yanked him back. A man loading grain outside the feed store spat into the dust and shook his head. Jane kept her eyes on the ridge. She had spent 4 years learning how to carry other people's opinions the way a mule carries a pack, evenly, without shifting, so nothing rubbed a sore. She did not turn her head. She did not straighten her back. She rode. Near the last house before the road opened into rangeland, the old woman from the church steps was waiting. She stood beside a low stone wall with her hands folded over the head of a hickory cane, and her shawl was the color of ash. Jane had never known her name, only that she had been old already when Jane was a child, and that she had once brought a jar of honey to Jane's mother when Jane's father had been carried home the last time. Jane slowed the mare. The old woman did not step forward. She only lifted her chin a little and looked up at Jane with eyes that had gone milk pale at the edges. "Child," she said. "Ma'am?" The old woman studied her a moment. Then she said, quiet and even, as if reciting something she had held in her mouth for years, "What they buried shallow." Jane waited for more. None came. The old woman's lips pressed closed and her hands tightened once on the cane. "Ma'am, go on now," the old woman said. "The wind's turning." Jane touched the brim of her hat. She wanted to ask 100 things, but a knowing came over her that questions would not be answered today, and might not be answered by this woman at all. She nudged the mare forward. When she looked back once, the old woman was still standing at the wall, watching her go, small and gray against the whitewash, Behind her, hooves came up the road at a canter. Jane did not stop, but she loosened her hand on the rein. The tall man from the boardwalk pulled his horse alongside hers. A good bay, 17 hands, sleek as polished walnut. Up close, his coat was finer still, dark wool with bone buttons, and a silver band on his hat that caught the sun. "Ashby," he said, as if she had asked. "Merrick Ashby. I run cattle north of the creek now. Used to be Halloran country. All of it." He gestured wide with one gloved hand, taking in the whole of the visible world. "All of it but that 1,000 acres you just paid $2 for." Jane said nothing. "I'll give you 5, he said. "Right now. 2.5 times what you paid. You ride back to the courthouse, sign it over, and you leave Dry Creek with money in your pocket instead of dust in your teeth." He smiled a wide, easy smile. "That's a kindness, girl. I'm offering you a kindness." "No, thank you," Jane said. His smile did not change, but something behind it did. He touched his hat. "Suit yourself. When you come back down that road in a week begging for supper, I'll remember I offered." He wheeled the bay and cantered back toward town, and the dust of him hung in the road a long time. Jane rode on. The sun was already tipping west, and the ridge ahead had gone the color of dried blood in the late light, and somewhere out past it, waiting, was 1,000 acres of ground the whole town had agreed to forget. She reached the gate at the blue hour, when the sky was neither day nor night, and the land held its breath between them. The gate itself was down. One post rotted through at the base, the crossbar tangled in cheatgrass. A brand had been burned into the wood a long time ago, but weather had scoured it until only a ghost of the shape remained. Jane dismounted and led the mare through on foot. The road up to the house was a suggestion more than a road. Sage had grown into it. A jackrabbit broke from a bush and vanished. She walked a quarter-mile before the house came into view, and when it did, she stopped, and the mare stopped behind her. And for a long moment, neither of them moved. The house sagged. That was the first word. It sagged at the porch, at the ridgepole, at one whole corner where the foundation stones had slipped. The windows were dark, most of them broken, one boarded with a plank nailed at a wrong angle. The barn beyond it leaned worse than the church in town. A corral fence had fallen into itself. A well stood in the yard, with its rope gone and its cover cracked. Everything was the color of driftwood. Everything had waited. Jane stood there until the last of the blue drained out of the sky. Then she led the mare to what was left of the corral, tied her where a rail still held, and unbuckled the saddle. She carried her bedroll to the porch. The porch boards groaned under her weight, but held. She did not go inside. Not yet. Not in the dark. She sat with her back against the wall of the house, and the deed folded against her chest. And she ate the last of the hardtack in her saddlebag, chewing slow. An owl called once from the barn. The mare shifted and blew. Somewhere in the boards behind her, a mouse ran along a joist and stopped. Jane listened. The house was not silent. It settled and ticked and breathed the way old wood does when the day's heat leaves it. It sounded, she thought, almost like a thing turning over in its sleep. She lay down on the bedroll with her coat pulled tight and her hat over her face, and she did not sleep for a long time. When she finally did, it was to the sound of something under the floor. Not a mouse, not the wind. A slow, patient creak, as if the house were setting a place at a table for someone who had finally come home. Jane woke at first light with frost on her coat and the taste of iron in her mouth. The mare was watching her from the corral, ears forward, as if the mare had been awake longer and knew things. Jane sat up slow. The porch was silver with dew. The eastern sky had begun to pink along the ridge, and the house behind her, in that pale wash, looked less like a ruin and more like a thing that had simply been waiting. She stood, stretched the stiffness out of her back, and pushed the front door open with her shoulder. The hinges gave without much argument. Inside smelled of dust, mouse, and something older beneath it. The faint sweetness of pine sap dried in the walls for 30 summers. The main room ran the length of the house. A stone hearth stood at one end, black inside, with a cast-iron kettle tipped on its side in the ash. A plank table with 2 chairs. A cupboard with its doors hanging open on one hinge each. In the far corner, a narrow bed with the ticking chewed through in a dozen places. Jane walked the room slowly. Her boots made a hollow sound on the floorboards, the sound a body makes crossing a bridge. She stopped in the middle of the room and stood still, listening. The house made small noises. None of them were the noise she had heard in the night. She crossed to the hearth. She ran her hand along the mantel, a single beam of dark wood, thick as her thigh, blackened at the underside from years of smoke. Her fingers caught on something, a notch, cut clean. She bent to see it. Not a burn, not a crack. A letter, an H carved deep, the way a man carves who means for the mark to outlast him. Beside it, a second letter, half hidden by soot. She rubbed her thumb across it. A W. Jane pulled her hand back. Walker, her own name. Cut into the mantel of a house that had, by every account she had ever heard, belonged to a family named Halloran. She stood at the hearth a long time. Her breath came shallow. She thought of her father, whom she had not thought of in a straight line for 8 years, and of the box Merrick Ashby had spoken of on the boardwalk. She thought of the old woman by the stone wall saying, "What they buried shallow." She did not act on it. She did not pry at the mantel or start pulling boards. Something in her, older than her 22 years, told her that the house had kept its secret this long and would keep it another day. She stepped back from the hearth. She walked to the window and looked out at the mare, who had lowered her head to crop what dry grass the corral still held. Outside, on the porch step, Jane sat and unfolded the deed and read her own name written in the clerk's careful hand. She folded it again and put it against her chest. Then she looked at the sagging barn, the fallen corral, the well without its rope, and she began, in her mind, to make a list. The list was long. She did not let that stop her. She had learned in Cheyenne that a long list becomes short if a person only picks up one thing at a time. She began that morning with the corral. She walked the fallen rails end to end and set aside the ones that had rot in them and stacked the ones that were sound. There were more sound rails than she had expected. Someone long ago had used good pine and set the posts deep. By midday she had rebuilt 8 feet of fence with nothing but her hands, a rock for a mallet, and the wire she cut from a rusted spool inside the barn. The mare watched. When Jane paused to drink from her canteen, the mare came to the new rail and pressed her nose against it, as if testing the work, and then blew softly and went back to grazing. That afternoon, Jane cleared the well. She lowered her belt with the buckle tied to a stone and drew up water the color of weak tea, which she poured on the ground until it ran clear. By the time the sun sat on the ridge, she had water she could boil. She built a small fire in the yard from broken corral rail and set the kettle from the hearth on 2 flat stones. The kettle had a hairline crack down one side. She turned the crack away from the fire, and it held. She slept the second night inside, on the floor by the hearth, with the mare's saddle blanket over her and her coat rolled under her head. She heard the creak again just before dawn, and this time she marked where it came from. Beneath the boards, toward the west wall. She lay still and listened until it stopped, and then she slept again until light. The next morning, she started on the barn. The doors had sagged off their top hinges, and she lifted them one at a time, set them square, and drove the pins back with the flat of an axe head she had found rusted into the chopping block. Inside the barn was a workbench, a broken plow, a coil of harness leather stiffened to iron, and, in the far stall, a rope halter hung on a peg with the initials burned into the leather browband, the same H, the same W. Jane took the halter down. The leather was cracked, but sound. She oiled it that evening with tallow scraped from the bottom of her saddlebag and worked it slow between her palms until it softened. The mare stood for her while she slipped it on. It fit as if it had been cut for her. Days passed like that. Jane rose with the light and worked until the light went. She patched the roof of the house with cedar shakes she split from a fallen tree at the edge of the pasture. She scythed the cheat grass back from the yard with a rusted blade she had honed on a river stone. She mended the cupboard door. She fixed the broken pane in the kitchen window with oiled paper and lath. Each task uncovered another small thing that did not fit. A brand iron in the tack room, its mark not the Halloran H, but a joined H and W, laid over each other like linked hands. A row of nails driven into the barn beam at eye height, spaced exactly a hand's width apart, 7 of them, as if to hang 7 of something now gone. A ledger scrap in the bottom of the cupboard, no cover, 3 pages, columns of numbers in a woman's hand, and at the bottom of the last page, a single line. Paid in full to J. Walker, Spring. The date had been torn away. Jane read the line 3 times. Then she folded the scrap and put it inside the deed, and put the deed back against her chest. She did not yet know what she was building. Her hands were learning it before her mind. Every board she straightened, every rail she set, every knot she tied in the mended halter. The house seemed to lean a little less. The mare grew calmer. The creak beneath the floor came almost every night now, always toward the west wall, always at the same hour, as if something under the boards were keeping time with her breath. On the 9th night, Jane took a lantern to the west wall. She had waited long enough. The creak came just after the owl called from the barn, the way it always did, and this time she was ready. She set the lantern on the floor and knelt beside it. The boards along the west wall ran the length of the room, wide pine planks dark with age and boot polish and lamp smoke. She pressed her palm flat against each one in turn, working from the corner outward, and on the 4th board from the wall she felt it give beneath her hand, a small breath of movement no wider than a pencil. She fetched the axe head from the barn. She worked the flat of it into the seam and lifted. The board came up whole, dry, and light in her hands, as if it had been meant to lift. Beneath it, in the crawl between the floor and the earth, was a tin box the size of a bread loaf, wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff as bark. Jane sat back on her heels. She did not reach for it. She looked at it in the lantern light and let her breath slow. Then she reached in with both hands and drew it up. The oilcloth cracked when she peeled it back. The tin beneath was army green, its lid stamped with a maker's mark she did not know. Its hinges rusted shut, but the clasp still working. She thumbed the clasp. The lid opened with a small, dry sigh. Inside, folded on top, was a woman's handkerchief with the initials M.W. embroidered in blue thread at one corner. Jane's mother had been Mary Walker. Jane held the handkerchief in the lantern light for a long moment and did not cry. She set it aside. Beneath the handkerchief lay a leather notebook, palm-sized, its cover stained dark at one corner in a shape Jane did not want to name. She opened it. The pages were filled in her father's hand. She knew his hand from a single Christmas card kept in her mother's Bible. Small, careful, slanted right. Dates ran down the left margin. Numbers ran down the right. In between were names of cattle, numbers of head, prices, and the initial A beside every entry. Ashby. The last date in the book was written in a hand that trembled. Beside it, her father had written, "Told him I would not sign. Told him the land was not his to take. He said then it will be no one's." Jane closed the notebook. She sat still on the floor for a long time. Beneath the notebook was a folded paper, brittle at the creases. She opened it under the lantern. It was a deed, older than the one against her chest, made out in her grandfather's name. Halloran on the mother's side, Walker on the father's. The two names joined by marriage on a line she had never seen written down. The 1,000 acres had been her family's before it had been anyone else's. The joined H and W on the brand iron in the barn had not been decoration. It had been a fact. Under the deed, at the bottom of the tin, wrapped in a second square of oilcloth, was a small revolver with 1 chamber fired and 5 still loaded, and beside it a lock of dark hair tied with a black ribbon. Jane closed the tin. She put the lid down slowly, as if it were a sleeping thing. She sat with her hands flat on the closed lid, and she understood, without needing to say it, why her father had come home in a box, why her mother had been run out with a child, why the town had laughed at $2 for 1,000 acres, and why the old woman by the stone wall had said what she had said. She sat until the lantern guttered. Then she wrapped the tin in her coat and slept with it beside her on the floor. The wind turned that night. Jane felt it before she woke. By dawn, the sky over the ridge had gone the color of wet slate, and by mid-morning, the first flakes were coming sideways across the pasture, though it was still weeks too early for snow. A late storm, the kind that killed cattle out of season and travelers who trusted the calendar. Jane brought the mare into the barn and forked her the last of the dry grass from the loft. She banked the fire in the hearth. She set the tin under a loose stone in the chimney base and mortared it back with mud from the yard. She had just finished when she heard the dog. It came first as a thin, ragged bark somewhere past the gate, then a second bark closer, and then silence. Jane took her coat off the peg and went out into the weather. The snow was thick enough now to soften the shapes of the corral rails. Halfway down the overgrown road she found them. A woman on foot leading a spent horse. A child of maybe 6 wrapped in a shawl against the woman's hip. And a black dog with 1 white foot circling them and barking at nothing and everything. "Come," Jane said. It was all she said. The woman did not argue. She followed Jane back up the road, the child's face pressed against her neck, the horse stumbling on legs gone stiff. Jane got them into the house, set the woman by the hearth, wrapped the child in the saddle blanket, and went back out for the horse. She led it into the barn beside the mare and rubbed it down with a twist of dry grass until it stopped shivering. By the time she came back to the house, the woman had found her voice. She was traveling to her sister in the next county, she said. The stage had gone through 2 days ago without her. A man in Dry Creek had told her the ridge road was passable. He had told her also, she said with her eyes on the fire, that the woman up here would turn her away. He was wrong, Jane said. The woman looked at her. Ashby, she said. That was the name. Jane put more wood on the fire. She set the kettle on. She did not answer. Outside, the storm rose to a howl, and the house creaked in every joint, and the wind came in under the door in a thin white line of snow that Jane stepped over as she moved between the hearth and the cupboard. The child slept. The woman slept, sitting up. Jane did not sleep. She sat by the fire with the notebook in her lap and read every page by the low red light, and by the time the storm broke near dawn, she had decided what she would do. She would not run. She would not sell. She would not carry the tin to the courthouse in the morning like a woman asking to be believed. She would finish the house. She would finish the barn. She would put cattle back on her family's grass, and when the town was ready to look, the truth would already be standing on its own 4 legs in the yard, waiting. The storm passed by mid-morning and left the ridge white and quiet. The traveler woke to the smell of coffee boiled from grounds Jane had scraped from the bottom of a tin, and the child woke to a bowl of the last of the hardtack softened in water. They ate slowly. When the sun was high enough to melt the road, Jane saddled the traveler's horse, set the woman and the child upon it, and walked them the 4 miles down to the fork where the county road met the ridge. She would not take payment. The woman looked back once from the saddle and said, "I will tell them." Jane touched the mare's halter and turned home. She did not know yet how far the woman would tell it. By the end of that week, a wagon came up the ridge road with a bay team and a man on the bench who wore a gray coat and spectacles. He was the county surveyor from 2 towns over, sent, he said, on a plain matter of record. He had heard from a woman lodging at his sister's house that a young woman on the old Halloran place had put a lost traveler by her fire in a storm that had killed 2 head of stock down valley. He had heard also, in the same telling, of a joined brand and a name that did not match the county rolls. He was a careful man. He asked to see what she had. Jane brought out the tin from beneath the chimney stone. He read the notebook without speaking for nearly an hour, turned the older deed in the light, and set both down on the plank table with the care of a man handling glass. "Miss Walker," he said quietly, "this is your land. It has been your land." He said he would file what needed filing. He said it plainly, the way a doctor names a bone. Word travels on a ridge road faster than a rider. Within days, an older lawyer rode up from the county seat, unasked, and stood on the porch with his hat in both hands. He had known her grandfather, he said. He had wondered all these years at the shape of the sail. He offered his hand and his service, and he named no fee. A cattleman from the north brought 4 heifers up the road in a borrowed wagon, and asked only that Jane pay him back in a calf when she could. The old woman from the stone wall walked the whole 4 miles up the ridge one afternoon, with a jar of honey in her shawl, set it on the plank table, and looked once at the mantel where the H and the soot-hidden W stood side by side. "Your mother knew," she said. "She was waiting for you to be old enough to know too." Then she walked back down. Merrick Ashby came last. He rode up alone on the 17-hand bay, and he did not dismount for a long while. When he finally stepped down, the silver band on his hat caught the low sun and threw it into the dust. He stood at the porch step and did not speak first. Jane waited. "I heard the surveyor came," he said at last. Jane said she supposed he had. He looked out at the 4 heifers grazing where the corral had been mended, at the barn doors squared on their hinges, at the mare in the halter with the burned initials. Something in his face went slack, not broken, only tired. The way a man looks when a long lie he has carried finally sets itself down of its own weight. "Your father was a better man than me," he said. "I knew it then. He did not ask forgiveness. He mounted the bay and rode back down the ridge, and the town, when he passed through it, watched him go with the same silence it had once used to watch Jane arrive. By the end of that season, the pasture carried 20 head. The house stood square on its foundation stones. The barn doors closed true. A second brand iron, cut fresh at the forge in town by a smith who would not take her coin, hung on the tack-room peg beside the old joined H and W, and the new iron carried the same 2 letters, cleaner, deeper, meant to last another 100 years. The road up the ridge was no longer overgrown. Children from the town rode up on Sundays to see the heifers, and their mothers came behind them with baskets, and the old woman from the stone wall was carried up once in a wagon and sat on the porch in the sun for a whole afternoon and did not speak and did not need to. On an evening in late autumn, at the golden hour, Jane stood at the mended gate with the mare beside her and looked back across the 1,000 acres. The light came low across the grass and turned the ridge the color of beaten copper. The cattle were moving toward the creek in a slow, dark line. The house behind her threw a long, clean shadow. The joined brand on the gatepost had been recut and stood plain against the wood. She thought of her mother in the room above the laundry 200 miles away, and of her father in a box he did not choose, and of a boy on a fence post who had run to tell the town a ghost had come home. She thought of 2 paper dollars folded soft as cloth against her chest. The old lawyer had asked her, a week before, what she meant to call the place now that the deed was clean. She had not answered him then. She answered now, aloud, to the mare and the wind and no one else. "It was never a graveyard," she said. It was a promise somebody kept. The mare flicked one ear and lowered her head to the grass. The sun slid another finger toward the ridge. Jane laid her hand flat on the top rail of the gate, felt the grain of the wood her own hands had planed, and stood there until the light went blue. She had come back with $2 and a borrowed coat. She had bought 1,000 acres of what the town called rot. She had found her name burned into the beam of a house that was never not hers, and she had put cattle back on her family's grass, and she had done it without raising her voice once. What the world dismissed had held, all along, the thing the world most needed to remember. She turned the mare toward the barn and walked her home in the last of the light. Thank you for staying to the end of this one. If Jane's long, quiet walk back to her own name moved you, leave a like, tell us in the comments where you were watching from, and subscribe so the next story finds you. Settle in soon for another, a widower, a wounded stallion nobody would touch, and a mountain pass that only one of them was meant to cross. Until then, ride easy. What would you do if the key to your future and the buried secrets of an entire county were hidden inside a dusty old book no one else wanted? Imagine winning a dead cattle baron's handwritten ledger at a packed estate auction for just $11. The sound of laughter echoing in your ears as you claim your prize. For 22-year-old Jane Alcott, that laughter was the loneliest sound in the world. But the truth waiting inside that leather-bound book was a secret so powerful, it would rewrite the maps and fortunes of everyone who had dismissed her. Settle in and let us know in the comments where you're watching from, because this is a story about how the most overlooked things often hold the most value. Jane Alcott stood at the back of the Cheyenne auction house, a ghost in her own life. The air was thick with the smell of cigar smoke, old paper, and the cloying sweetness of perfume worn by the wives of men who had come to pick over the bones of Silas Croft's empire. Jane felt the weight of her 22 years as if they were 60. Her hands, raw and chapped from work that no longer existed, were tucked into the pockets of her father's worn duster. It was all she had left of him. This coat and the quiet ache in her chest that had been a constant companion since they'd laid him in the ground 2 months prior. His ranch, the Alcott homestead that had been the only world she'd ever known, had been swallowed by the same man whose worldly goods were now being scattered to the highest bidder, Silas Croft. The name was a bitter stone in her throat. She had come today not to buy, but to watch, to see the end of the man who had authored her own ending. She had 3 $20 gold pieces sewn into the lining of her coat, and another $11 in worn bills in her pocket. Money that was supposed to last her until she found work in a town that had no work for a woman who knew horses and land, but not much else. The auctioneer's voice was a rhythmic drone, a litany of power and possession. He sold off Croft's mahogany desk, his silver spurs, his herd of prize-winning bulls, each item fetching a price that could have saved her father's ranch 10 times over. With every rap of the gavel, a piece of Croft's legacy was hammered into a new owner's hands, and Jane felt a hollow sort of justice. The man had collected things, land, cattle, people's debts, and now his collection was being dispersed like dust in the wind. She watched Sterling Croft, Silas's son, preening in the front row. He was a man made of soft edges and expensive fabric, his face smooth and unlined by sun or worry. He bid on nothing, merely observed with an air of bored entitlement, as if this were all a formality before the true inheritance. The land, the banknotes, the power, was settled into his name. Jane's gaze drifted over the tables piled with lesser items, the forgotten artifacts of a life, and then she saw it. It was part of a lot of miscellaneous office supplies, a tarnished inkwell, a handful of dried-up pens, and a thick, leather-bound book described by the auctioneer as one personal accounts ledger, contents unknown, likely of little value. The book was plain, its dark green leather scuffed at the corners, the spine unbroken but tired. While the bidders leaned forward for a gilded mirror or a pearl-handled pistol, they slumped back in their chairs for this. Sterling Croft let out a short, dismissive laugh that was audible even at the back of the room. He murmured something to the man beside him, and a ripple of amusement spread through the front rows. A ledger, a book of numbers. In a world of cattle and land, it was less than nothing. A relic. The auctioneer, sensing the room's disinterest, tried to inject some energy. "Do I hear $20 for this lot? A piece of history, gentlemen. The very book where the great Silas Croft recorded his dealings. $20? Silence. 10 then. Do I hear 10? A man in the third row yawned. Jane felt a strange pull, a current of defiance she hadn't felt since her father's funeral. That book had been on Croft's desk. It had been in his hands. Her father's name might be in the book, a single-line item in the long list of men he'd ruined. Owning it felt like a small, private reclamation. It was a foolish thought, born of grief and anger. But it took root. $5? The auctioneer pleaded. Jane's heart began to beat a little faster. She thought of the $11 in her pocket. It was meant for food, for a week's rent in a rooming house. But what was a week? Another 7 days of being a ghost. "I'll bid $5, a man near the front said, his voice bored. He was likely buying the inkwell. "I have 5. Do I hear 6? Jane's hand trembled as she raised it just high enough to be seen. Her voice was raspy from disuse. $6. Heads turned. A few people squinted, trying to place the girl in the oversized coat. Sterling Croft's gaze swept over her, a flicker of annoyance in his eyes. He didn't know her, but he knew her type. Dust, poverty, irrelevance. The man who had bid 5 shook his head, uninterested in a contest. I have $6 from the young lady in the back. Do I hear 7? There was a long pause. Then, a man aiming to irritate Sterling, or perhaps just for sport, called out, $10. Sterling Croft smiled thinly. The game was on. The auctioneer's energy returned. $10! Now we're moving! Do I hear 11? All eyes were on Jane. Her face burned. This was foolish. It was grocery money. It was survival. But the image of her father's face, etched with worry in the lamplight as he looked over his own failing books, flashed in her mind. 11, she said, her voice clearer this time. The word hung in the air. The man who had bid 10 shrugged and turned away. The sport was over. The auctioneer looked around the room. Sold, he declared, his gavel cracking against the podium. For $11. To the young lady at the back. A wave of soft, condescending laughter washed over the room. Jane Alcott had just spent her last free dollar on a dead man's worthless diary. What was she thinking? Was it a desperate grasp at a past she couldn't reclaim? Or did some deeper instinct guide her hand? What secrets could possibly be hiding in a simple book of numbers? Let us know what you would have done in the comments below. And if you're enjoying our story, please consider subscribing for more tales of hidden history. Now, as Jane stepped forward to claim her prize, the weight of the world's judgment felt almost as heavy as the book itself. The laughter followed her as she walked to the clerk's table, a hot wave of shame at her back. She counted out the worn bills and a handful of coins, her hands shaking slightly. The clerk, a man with a green visor and an impatient air, barely looked at her as he pushed the lot across the polished wood. She ignored the inkwell and pens, her focus entirely on the ledger. It was heavier than she'd expected, dense with paper and secrets. The leather was cool and smooth beneath her fingers. She tucked it under her arm, the book's hard edge a comfort against her side. As she turned to leave, her path was blocked by Sterling Croft. He stood with his hands in the pockets of his tailored waistcoat, a look of amused pity on his face. "Quite the treasure you've unearthed," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. The men with him chuckled. Jane said nothing, her gaze fixed on a point just past his shoulder. She wanted only to be away from this place, away from these people. "Tell you what," Sterling continued, lowering his voice into a conspiratorial whisper. "My father was a sentimental man. I'd hate to see his scribblings discarded. I'll give you $20 for it. Double your money. You can buy yourself a decent meal." He made it sound like an act of charity, but his eyes were cold. It was a power play, a final dismissal. He was offering to buy back his father's trash to prove how little it, and by extension she, mattered. The offer was tempting. $20 was a fortune. It was safety. It was another 2 weeks of life. But looking at his smug face, Jane felt that flicker of defiance harden into resolve. This book was the one thing in Silas Croft's empire that his son hadn't wanted, and now it was hers. "No, thank you," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I'll keep it." Sterling's smile tightened. He hadn't expected to be refused. "Suit yourself," he sneered. "I'm sure it will make for fascinating reading." He stepped aside, and Jane walked past him, her head held high, not letting herself hurry until she was through the double doors and back in the bracing Wyoming air. The town of Cheyenne was a swirl of dust and noise, but she felt utterly alone. She started walking toward the livery stable at the edge of town, the only place she could afford to keep her father's old horse. As she passed a narrow alleyway, a voice, dry as autumn leaves, stopped her. "Some men write their sins in ink," the voice said. "Others write them in dust. Croft wrote his in both." Jane turned to see an old Shoshone woman sitting on an apple crate. Her face a beautiful map of wrinkles, a clay pipe held loosely in one hand. She was wrapped in a trade blanket, her dark eyes fixed on the ledger under Jane's arm. Jane didn't know what to say. The woman's gaze was not unkind, but it was heavy, filled with a knowledge that felt ancient. The woman gave a slow, deliberate nod. "You mind what you read in that book, girl? A man's accounts tell you what he bought. His secrets tell you what he owned." Before Jane could form a question, the woman turned her attention back to the street, as if their conversation was already a thing of the past. The cryptic warning settled over Jane, a strange and unsettling premonition. She clutched the ledger tighter and continued on her way, the whispers of the townspeople seeming to follow her, their words of pity and mockery fading into the vast, indifferent Wyoming wind. She reached the livery stable as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in bruised shades of orange and purple. The scent of hay, horses, and old leather was a balm to her frayed nerves. It was the smell of home. At the far end of the stable, in the last stall, was Pilgrim. Her father's horse was a tall gelding, his coat the color of worn buckskin, his muzzle gone gray with age. He lifted his head as she approached, his large, dark eyes soft and knowing. He blew a warm breath into her outstretched hand, a silent greeting that spoke more than words ever could. "Hey, old friend," she murmured, stroking his neck. He was her last link to her past, the only living creature who had known her father's touch as well as she had. The stable owner, a kind but weary man named Gus, who had known her family for years, had agreed to let her keep Pilgrim there in exchange for her mucking out stalls. He also let her use a small, windowless tack room in the back, a space barely large enough for a cot and a small wood stove. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. As night fell, Jane lit a single kerosene lantern, its golden light pushing back the deep shadows of the room. The air grew cold quickly. She sat on the edge of her cot, Pilgrim shifting and sighing softly in the stall just outside her door. A comforting, rhythmic presence. She placed the heavy ledger on her lap. For a long moment, she just looked at it. The laughter from the auction house echoed in her ears. Sterling Croft's mocking face swam in her memory. Had she made a terrible mistake? Wasted her last dollars on a dead man's forgotten paperwork out of foolish pride? With a deep breath, she opened the cover. The first page was blank, save for a single stark inscription in the center. S.C., his mark and his measure. She turned the page. The paper was thick, high-quality stock, filled with line after line of dense, spidery handwriting. It was a dizzying array of dates, names, and numbers. At first glance, it was exactly what everyone had assumed it to be, a meticulous record of ranching business. May 3rd, 1884. To Miller's Crossing, 200 head. Feed cost, $40. Sold, $3,200. May 5th, 1884. From Silas Blackwood, 12 tons hay. Cost, $60. It went on and on, page after page, a meticulous, almost obsessive record of every transaction, every head of cattle, every bag of feed. Her heart sank. It was nothing. Just a book of numbers. The townspeople were right. She had bought a piece of trash. She flipped through the pages, a growing sense of disappointment washing over her. She saw the names of ranchers she knew, men who had prospered under Croft's shadow, and men who had failed. It was all there, a dry accounting of the economics that governed their lives. She felt foolish and exhausted, the emotional high of her defiance crashing into the hard reality of her situation. She was alone in a cold room with a useless book and a future that was a perfect, terrifying blank. The lantern flame flickered, casting long, dancing shadows on the wall. Outside, the wind began to howl, a lonely sound that matched the emptiness inside her. She was about to close the ledger and surrender to sleep when a familiar name caught her eye. It was a name she knew well, and it shouldn't have been there. The name was Jedediah Stone. He had been their neighbor to the west, a good man with a small herd and a smaller portion of luck. He had lost his ranch last spring after the fever took half his cattle. Jane remembered the day he and his family had loaded their wagon and headed east, their faces grim with defeat. His entry in the ledger was dated just a week before he left. It was simple, almost cryptic. Jedediah Stone, 200. Next to the number was a small, meticulously drawn symbol, a single, straight fence post with 2 strands of wire wrapped around it. It made no sense. 200 what? Cattle? He'd never had that many. Dollars? It was far too little to save his ranch, and far too much for a simple loan without explanation. And the drawing of the fence post was bizarre, a piece of idle doodling in a book that was otherwise ruthlessly efficient. Jane stared at the entry, a frown creasing her brow. It was an anomaly, a detail that refused to fit the pattern of the rest of the ledger. She had spent her life on a ranch. She knew how records were kept. You noted what was sold, what was bought, the price, the date. You didn't add cryptic numbers and little pictures. She ran her finger over the entry, the ink slightly raised against the smooth paper. It felt deliberate, important. She put the book down and paced the small room, the floorboards creaking under her worn boots. The old Shoshone woman's words came back to her. A man's accounts tell you what he bought. His secrets tell you what he owned. Was this a secret? She went back to the ledger, her initial disappointment replaced by a flicker of intense curiosity. She began to scan the pages not for what made sense, but for what didn't. She started looking for other entries, like Jedediah's, a name followed by a number and a strange, small symbol. It took nearly an hour, but she found another. Abigail Finch, 50. Next to it, a tiny, perfect drawing of a water bucket. Abigail Finch was a widow who owned the town's only laundry service. $50 was a significant sum for her. What could it mean? And the bucket? Then another. Marcus Thorne, 500. Next to it, the outline of a branding iron, the brand itself left blank. Marcus Thorne owned the smithy. He'd had to sell his prize stallion a few months ago to cover a debt. Jane's mind raced. These weren't business transactions. They were something else. They felt personal. A list of debts, perhaps? But they weren't recorded like any debts she had ever seen. There were no terms, no interest rates, no due dates, just a name, a number, and a symbol. It was a code. And Silas Croft was the only one who had held the key. The wind rattled the loose-fitting door of the tack room, and Pilgrim nickered softly in his stall, a low, comforting sound in the deep quiet of the night. Jane felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. She was on the edge of something. She could feel it. A truth hidden in plain sight, dismissed by everyone as worthless. She didn't yet understand what she was looking at, but she knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones that this book was no mere diary. It was a reckoning. The next morning, Jane rose before dawn, her mind sharp with a purpose she hadn't felt in months. She left Pilgrim with fresh hay and water, promising she'd be back soon. With the ledger tucked safely inside her coat, she walked through the sleeping town to the county clerk's office. She spent 2 of her precious dollars on the largest, most detailed map of Elkhorn County they had. It was a sprawling sheet of paper showing every registered parcel of land, every river, every road, from the town of Cheyenne to the distant mountains. Back in the quiet solitude of her tack room, she unrolled the map on the floor, weighting its corners with a hammer, a spare horseshoe, and 2 flat stones. The lantern cast a pool of light over the intricate lines and names. With the ledger open beside her, she began the slow, painstaking work of cross-referencing. She started with the names she knew, the ones with the strange symbols. Jedediah Stone. She found his former property on the map, a neat square bordering what had been her father's land. She took a piece of charcoal from the stove and made a small mark on the map, a simple X. Next, Abigail Finch. Her laundry was a small building on Creek Street. Jane found the lot on the town map inset and marked it. Marcus Thorne, the blacksmith. His smithy and the small house behind it were on the edge of town. Another X. She worked for hours, fueled by stale bread and cold water. The tack room became her world. The rhythmic sounds of the stable, the stomp of a hoof, the swish of a tail, the low murmur of Gus talking to the horses faded into a distant hum. Pilgrim stood watch by the door, his quiet presence a steady anchor. He would occasionally poke his head into the room, nudging her shoulder with his soft nose as if to remind her to rest. She would stroke his face, murmur a few words, and then turn back to her work. As she moved through the ledger, a chilling pattern began to emerge. Every name she found with a cryptic symbol corresponded to a person or family who had fallen on hard times within the last 5 years. They were small ranchers, shopkeepers, families who had lost everything to drought, sickness, or bad luck. And on the map, her charcoal X's were beginning to form a constellation of misfortune, a dark galaxy of loss that spread across the entire county. She found dozens of entries: a baker whose shop had burned down, a farmer whose crop had failed, a freighter whose best team had gone lame. Each one was marked in the ledger with a name, a number, and a unique symbol: a sheaf of wheat, a wagon wheel, a key. She began to understand. The symbols weren't random doodles. They were collateral. The fence post wasn't just a post. It represented Jedediah Stone's land, defined by its fences. The water bucket was Abigail Finch's well, the most valuable part of her laundry business. The branding iron was the smithy himself, the core of his livelihood. Silas Croft hadn't been just a cattle baron. He had been the county's secret banker, its silent, unseen predator. He gave out loans to people in their most desperate moments, not through the bank, but personally. And he didn't secure his loans with legal paperwork filed at the courthouse. He secured them with a name, a number, and a symbol in his private ledger. He owned their debts, and through their debts, he owned them. The realization settled upon her not with a shout, but with a cold, terrifying quiet. She felt as though she were reading a ghost story, the final testament of a man who had collected souls. She kept working, her fingers smudged with charcoal, her eyes burning from the lantern light. The map was now covered in marks, a testament to Croft's silent conquest. Then she turned a page and her breath caught in her throat. There, halfway down the left-hand column, was a name that made her world stop: Elias Alcott, her father. The entry was dated just 3 months before his death, the time he had come home from town looking older, grayer, His shoulders slumped in defeat. He had told her he'd secured a loan to buy feed to get them through the winter, but he'd never said from where. He had only said it came at a high cost. She had thought he meant the interest. Now she saw the truth. Next to his name was the number 1,000, $1,000. It was the exact amount he'd needed, and beside the number was the symbol. It was a small, perfect drawing of a smooth, flat river stone, the kind found only in the creek bed that marked the western boundary of their property. Her father had used one just like it, a stone with a unique white stripe to mark the cornerstone of their homestead when he first filed the claim. It was a detail so specific, so personal, only he and Silas Croft could have known its significance. This book wasn't just a record of liens. It was the liens themselves. In an era where a man's word and a signature were often the law, this ledger, in Croft's own hand, was a binding document. He had never foreclosed on these people through the courts because he hadn't needed to. He held the proof of their debt, and with it, their futures, in his hand. He could call it in at any time, and they would be ruined. And now, that power was in her hands. The weight of the book on her lap felt immense, biblical. It held the fate of dozens of families, her own included. It was a weapon, a key, a burden. She looked from her father's name in the book to the blank space on the map where their ranch used to be, a space now legally owned by the Croft estate. A cold fury, clean and sharp, rose in her. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about justice. A justice her father and so many others had been denied. She traced the drawing of the river stone with her fingertip, a silent promise to the man who had placed it there. The tack room was silent, save for the sound of her own breathing and the steady, sleeping breaths of the old horse just outside her door. The world had laughed at her for buying a worthless book, but they hadn't known. They had been laughing at their own chains, and she was the only one holding the key. A sudden, violent gust of wind slammed against the stable, making the old timbers groan. The gentle night breeze had turned into a low, menacing howl. Jane looked up from the ledger, startled. Through the cracks in the tack room door, she could see not blackness, but a swirling, milky white. A blizzard. It had come out of nowhere, a furious, unseasonable storm sweeping down from the mountains. The temperature in the small room dropped instantly. She quickly stoked the small wood stove, adding the last of her precious firewood. The wind shrieked, and the fine, dry snow began to force its way through every crack and seam in the old building. Pilgrim stamped his feet nervously in his stall, his anxiety a palpable thing. Jane went to him, speaking in low, soothing tones, her hand firm on his neck. Just as she was calming him, the main stable doors burst open with a crash, flung wide by the force of the gale. A man stumbled in, half frozen and covered in snow, shouting over the roar of the wind. Behind him, a woman huddled, clutching a small child. Their wagon, one wheel splintered and broken, was just visible through the white curtain of the storm. "Help us!" the man cried, his voice hoarse. "Our axle broke. We need shelter." Gus was gone for the night, and the stable was otherwise empty. There was no one else. Jane didn't hesitate. "In here," she called, waving them toward the relative warmth of her small tack room. She helped the man, whose name was Thomas, lead his shivering wife, Mary, and their little boy into the room. Mary was pale and clearly exhausted, her pregnancy obvious beneath her heavy coat. Jane settled them on her own cot, wrapping them in her only blankets. She gave them the last of her bread and a tin cup of water, which she heated on the stove. The small room was crowded now, but the presence of the family pushed back against the storm's fury, creating a small island of warmth and safety. Thomas explained they were heading west, hoping to claim a small parcel of land, but the sudden storm had caught them unawares. As Mary and the boy drifted into an exhausted sleep, Thomas sat by the stove, his eyes full of a weary gratitude. He looked at Jane, at her simple cot, and the strange map spread on the floor. "You're being mighty kind to us, miss," he said. "We have nothing to repay you with." "No repayment needed," Jane replied quietly, her eyes on the ledger she had carefully placed on a high shelf, away from the damp. "People have to look out for one another." The storm raged for hours, a relentless assault of wind and snow. In the flickering lantern light, surrounded by the sleeping family she had taken in, Jane felt a profound shift within herself. The ledger was a document of power, a tool of financial leverage. Sterling Croft would have used it to crush people, to expand his inheritance. His father had used it to own them. But as she looked at the vulnerable faces of her guests, she saw another path. The book wasn't just a list of debts. It was a record of community, of shared hardship. It was a map of her neighbors' secret sorrows. Protecting this family felt inextricably linked to protecting the secrets in the book. It wasn't about claiming ownership or settling scores. It was about stewardship. She was the keeper of these stories now, and what she did next would determine if they were stories of ruin or stories of redemption. She had to commit, fully. When the first light of dawn finally broke, painting the snow-covered world in shades of gray and blue, the wind had died, and a deep silence had fallen. The crisis had passed. Jane knew with absolute clarity what she had to do. The town of Cheyenne awoke to a world transformed, buried under 2 feet of pristine, silent snow. The air was sharp and clean. As soon as the roads were passable, Jane left the sleeping family in the care of a now-returned Gus, promising to come back. She wrapped the precious ledger in oilcloth to protect it, and walked the quiet, snow-packed streets to the county courthouse. The county clerk's office was warm, smelling of dry paper and stove smoke. Mr. Abernathy, a man whose life was ruled by the neat lines in his record books, was already at his desk. He was a stern, meticulous man, not known for his patience. He looked up over his spectacles as Jane entered, his expression a mixture of surprise and mild annoyance. "Miss Alcott, what can I do for you?" he asked, his tone suggesting he hoped the answer was nothing. At that moment, the door opened again, and Sterling Croft strode in, brushing snow from the shoulders of his expensive wool coat. He was there to begin filing the probate papers for his father's estate, to officially claim his inheritance. He saw Jane, and a smirk touched his lips. "Still clutching your little scrapbook, I see," he said. "Don't tell me you found a secret treasure map." Jane ignored him. She looked directly at Mr. Abernathy and placed the ledger on the counter between them. "Mr. Abernathy," she said, her voice steady, "I believe this book is a legal record of private loans and liens made by Silas Croft. I need you to verify it." Abernathy raised an eyebrow. Sterling let out a short, barking laugh. "A record of what? That's my father's ranching log. It's worthless. Now, if you'll excuse us, miss, I have actual business to conduct." "Please," Jane insisted, her gaze unwavering, "just look." With a sigh of theatrical impatience, Abernathy pulled the book toward him. He opened it, his eyes scanning the first few pages with a practiced, dismissive air. "I see cattle counts, feed prices. This is exactly what Mr. Croft says it is. A farm ledger." "Keep reading," Jane said softly. "Look for the inconsistencies." To his credit, Abernathy was a man who, above all else, respected the integrity of a record. Something in Jane's tone made him pause. He turned a few more pages. He stopped. His finger traced a line. It was Jedediah Stone's entry. He looked at it for a long time, his brow furrowed in concentration. He then pulled a massive, leather-bound county plat book from the shelf behind him and opened it on the counter. The room was silent except for the rustle of paper and the ticking of the grand clock on the wall. Sterling shifted his weight, his amusement fading into irritation. Abernathy ran his finger down a column in the county book, then looked back at the ledger. He flipped a page in Croft's book, found another name, and repeated the process. A strange expression began to dawn on his face. His professional disinterest gave way to a dawning shock, then a profound, solemn gravity. He looked up from the books, his eyes wide. He stared first at Jane, then at Sterling. "My God," he whispered, "it's all here." He began to speak, more to himself than to them. "These symbols, they're collateral. The numbers are the principal. There are notes scribbled in the margins in a personal shorthand. They're the terms of agreement." He looked at Sterling, his face pale. "This isn't just a logbook, Mr. Croft. This appears to be your father's private, legally binding record of dozens, perhaps hundreds, of unrecorded liens against property and assets all over this county. Each entry, in his own hand, constitutes a contract." The rescued stranger, Thomas, appeared at the doorway, having come to thank Jane again. He stood there listening, a witness to the turning of the tide. Sterling Croft stared, his face ashen, the color draining from it as he finally understood. The inheritance he had come to claim was not what he thought. His father's true empire wasn't in land or cattle, but in the debts of his neighbors. And the proof, the sole legal claim to it all, was in the hands of the dusty girl in the oversized coat he had laughed out of the auction house. The town's mockery had fallen silent. The vindication was quiet, absolute, and devastating. The golden hour light slanted across the porch of the Alcott homestead, turning the snow-covered fields into a sea of shimmering gold. A week had passed, a week in which the world had been remade. Jane stood on the familiar wooden planks, her hand resting on the smooth, worn porch rail her father had built. The air was cold and still. The ranch was hers again, the first of the debts to be settled. The ledger had proven her father's loan from Croft was secured only by the property itself, and with Croft's death, the unrecorded lien had become a simple debt against the estate, one she had settled for pennies on the dollar. News had traveled with the speed of a prairie fire. The story of the $11 ledger had become a local legend. People who had once whispered about the foolish girl now spoke her name with a kind of hushed reverence. They came to her, not as supplicants to a new baron, but as neighbors seeking fairness. She met with them one by one in the same courthouse office where her discovery had been validated. With Mr. Abernathy as a witness, she opened the ledger and addressed each debt. For those whose lands had been taken, she used the ledger's power to restore their titles. For those still struggling under the weight of what they owed, she drew up new, fair terms, canceling the predatory interest that had been recorded in Croft's cryptic shorthand. She was not a creditor. She was an archivist of justice, a restorer of balances. Sterling Croft had left town on the first train heading east, his inheritance reduced to a fraction of its expected value, his reputation in tatters. He was humbled, not by force, but by the quiet, undeniable truth written in his own father's hand. Pilgrim grazed peacefully in the near pasture, his head low, his breath misting in the cold air. He was home. Gus, the old stableman, rode up and dismounted, his weathered face etched with a proud smile. He stood beside Jane on the porch, looking out at the land. "Never seen anything like it," he said, his voice full of wonder. "You hold the paper on half the county, Janie. What are you going to do with all that power?" Jane looked down at the green leather ledger she held in her hands. She ran her thumb over the scuffed cover. She thought of the fear in the faces of the family she'd sheltered from the storm, the desperation in her father's eyes, the quiet dignity of the people who had come to her seeking not a handout, but a fair chance. She looked at the vast, beautiful, and unforgiving land that stretched out before her, now stitched back together with threads of hope. "This isn't a weapon, Gus," she said, her voice soft but clear in the evening air. "It's a map home. Thank you for staying with us to the very end of this journey. This has been a story about finding value where no one else can see it, a reminder that true strength often lies in quiet persistence. If you were moved by Jane's story, we'd be so grateful if you'd like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe to our channel for more tales that uncover the hidden heart of history. We have another story coming soon, about a lonely lighthouse keeper who discovers a message in a bottle that will change the fate of a distant kingdom. We'll see you then.